They would do things like foul my other teammates. They would freeze the ball for as long as they could. They would do all sorts of dumb things. They weren't even trying to win the game. They were from the Board of Education. Because whenever people see me now, they go, 20,000.
October 1999, one of basketball's greatest giants passed away. Wilt Chamberlain, the man who once scored 100 points in a single game, died alone in his fortress-like mansion high above Los Angeles. But here's what nobody talks about. When Wilt died, two of the most important people in his life weren't speaking to him. His best friend had been silent for 24 years. His protege had called him a crybaby and a quitter. And Wilt, he never forgave any of them. This is the story of 5 players and people Wilt Chamberlain would never forgive, and how his pride turned basketball's most dominant force into one of its loneliest legends. Wilt Chamberlain dominated basketball like nobody before or since. 7'1", impossibly strong, and blessed with skills that defied his size. But here's the truth that gets buried under all those incredible stats. Wilt carried grudges like championship rings, and he had plenty of both. See, Wilt wasn't just fighting opponents on the court. He was fighting racism, fighting for respect, and eventually fighting with everyone who dared question his character. And that list got longer as the years went on. By the time he died, Wilt had created an army of enemies, some who had been his closest friends. The wildest part? Most of these feuds started because Wilt simply couldn't let anything go. Let's start with where this all began. The racism. The brutal, ugly racism that shaped everything about how Wilt saw the world and everyone in it. Picture this. It's 1959, Wilt's rookie season in the NBA. He's already breaking records, already changing the game. Then one night, an opposing player named Clyde Lovellette gets ejected. Why? He called Wilt a racial slur right there on the court. Not whispered, not hidden, out loud, in front of everyone. Lovellette wasn't alone either. Wilt faced excessive roughness every single night, and he believed much of it was racially motivated. Players targeted him with elbows, with cheap shots, with violence that went way beyond normal basketball contact. But here's where Wilt's psychology gets complicated. After that incredible rookie season, Wilt actually threatened to quit the NBA. He said the roughness was too much, but the real reason? Fear. Wilt was terrified that if he fought back, if he responded to all that violence, it would make his entire race look bad. In his own words, if he got into fistfights on the court, it would reflect on him and then indirectly on his race. So Wilt held it all in. Every slur, every cheap shot, every attack. He absorbed it all because he saw himself as representing something bigger than basketball. He convinced himself he was continuing his career to do more good for his race than quitting would do. If you're watching this and thinking about how heavy that burden must have been, drop a comment below about whether you think athletes today face similar pressure. And while you're down there, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started with this story. Now here's where that trauma becomes important, because Wilt made his career about more than just basketball. Because he tied his entire identity to being a representative of black excellence who never lost his cool, any criticism of his character became a nuclear attack in his mind. If someone questioned his effort, his resolve, or his competitive fire, Wilt didn't just hear criticism, he heard the same racist attacks from his rookie year all over again. That's the key to understanding everything that came next. Wilt's pride wasn't just pride, it was armor, and that armor got heavier and more impenetrable with every passing year. But not everyone believed Wilt's claims about racism. Bob Cousy, the white Celtics legend, publicly dismissed Wilt as the biggest complainer ever to hit the NBA. Cousy said he'd never seen any evidence of racial prejudice in his 10 years in the league. Think about that. A white player telling a black player that racism didn't exist because he personally hadn't seen it. Wilt's response was perfect, though. He said maybe if Bill Russell said it, he'd pay attention, but Cousy had never encountered the problems that he and Russell faced. Translation? Only another black athlete who lived that experience could judge him. Everyone else needed to stay quiet. That attitude, that circle of who could and couldn't criticize him, it would define the rest of Wilt's life. The racism didn't stop at the arena doors either. While playing for the San Francisco Warriors, Wilt tried to buy a house in an upscale neighborhood called Golden Gate Heights. The developer rejected him publicly, not quietly, not privately. He told the newspaper that he felt interracial mixing of neighborhoods devalues property. The developer went further, saying he didn't like them very much as a group, though he hypocritically added that individually he liked them. This was explicit, shameless bigotry, and Wilt was helpless to fight it. Even fame, even being one of the most recognized athletes in America, couldn't get him the basic right to buy a house where he wanted. So Wilt did what Wilt always did when the world rejected him. He built a fortress. He moved to Los Angeles and constructed a massive, isolated home high above Bel Air called Ursa Major. This wasn't just a house, it was a statement. Redwood, glass, and stone, perched away from everyone with views that looked down on the city that looked down on him. Ursa Major became Wilt's ultimate defense against a world that celebrated him on the court but denied him dignity off it. That mansion symbolized everything about Wilt's personality: control, isolation, pride so absolute that he'd rather be alone than risk being hurt again. Now we get to the big one, the feud that broke Wilt's heart more than any other: Bill Russell. If you know anything about basketball history, you know these two were were rivals. Russell's Celtics beat Wilt's teams over and over. But here's what people forget. They were friends. Real friends. They shared Thanksgiving dinners together. Wilt joked about how Russell would eat his mother's food and then whip his butt the next day on the court. This wasn't fake rivalry for the cameras. They genuinely cared about each other. Until Game 7 of the 1969 NBA Finals. Wilt was playing for the Lakers. Russell was playing his final game ever for the Celtics. Late in the game, Wilt had to leave. He had a severe knee injury that he later said was a torn Achilles tendon. The Lakers lost. Russell won his last championship. And then Russell said something that Wilt would never ever forgive. Russell claimed Wilt copped out of the game. He said any injury short of a broken leg or broken back wasn't good enough to justify missing the end of a deciding game. Russell admitted later that his anger came from Wilt's absence, clouding his own victory, like a misspelled word at the end of a cherished book. But for Wilt, this was the ultimate betrayal. His best friend, the one person who understood the racial pressure they both carried, had publicly questioned his character, called him a quitter. That word, quitter, it struck at the exact wound left by all that rookie year trauma. Because Wilt had almost quit then, terrified of how his race would judge him. Now his closest friend was using that same language. Wilt stopped talking to Russell, just like that. 24 years, decades of silence. Now here's where Wilt's stubbornness and pride really shine through. Russell did apologize eventually, but he apologized through the press, publicly, and that wasn't enough for Wilt. Wilt demanded a private, direct apology, something commensurate with how close they'd been, something that acknowledged the depth of the betrayal. Russell never gave him that, so Wilt stayed angry. For 24 years, right up until his death. Think about that. Wilt valued his pride more than a friendship that had survived one of sports' greatest rivalries. He'd rather die alone than accept an apology that didn't meet his exact specifications. The thing is, this wasn't just about basketball, or even about that one moment in 1969. This was about two men who understood each other in ways nobody else could. Russell and Wilt both lived through the same racial battles. They both carried the weight of representing their people. They both faced the impossible expectations placed on black athletes in an era when segregation was still fresh and racism was still loud. They should have been brothers for life. Instead, Wilt's need to control every aspect of how people treated him, his inability to accept anything less than perfection in how others showed respect, it poisoned the one friendship that should have been unbreakable. What makes it worse is how unnecessary the whole thing was. Russell's comment was harsh. Sure, it was unfair, absolutely, but it came from a place of competitive frustration, not real malice. Russell was upset that his final moment got overshadowed. That's human. That's understandable. A real friendship could have survived that. A phone call, a conversation, maybe a few harsh words back and forth, and it could have been over. But Wilt couldn't do that. He needed Russell to grovel. He needed the apology delivered exactly his way, on his terms, meeting his standards. And when Russell wouldn't play by those rules, Wilt just shut the door. 24 years of silence because Russell wouldn't apologize the right way. That's not strength. That's not even pride. That's just sad. Wilt even rationalized the whole thing by suggesting Russell was just jealous of his post-career success. He said some of his contemporaries hadn't been so successful off the court, implying Russell's bitterness came from professional envy. It was vintage Wilt. Deflect the criticism. Protect the pride at all costs. Never, ever admit you might be wrong. Then there's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the next great center. The guy who should have been Wilt's heir, his successor, the player he mentored and guided. Instead, they ended up in one of basketball's nastiest feuds. And guess who started it? Wilt. After retiring in 1973, Wilt became Kareem's loudest critic. He publicly questioned Kareem's intensity, his effort, his rebounding. Wilt suggested Kareem should have retired earlier, that he didn't maximize his talents. Why? Because in Wilt's mind, Kareem was the only obstacle to him being considered the premier center of all time. Wilt couldn't stand the idea of someone else claiming his throne. Wilt wrote in his 1991 book that Kareem felt Wilt was the only one standing in the way of his historical greatness. He asked rhetorically whether Kareem could score, rebound, run, or pass better than him. He flat out declared he was too strong for Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. For years, Wilt poked and prodded and criticized, and finally in 1990, Kareem had enough. Kareem published an open letter. Some versions were even titled Wilt Chamberlain. It was brutal. Kareem accused Wilt of being driven by jealousy and envy. He brought up Wilt's history of quitting, starting with leaving Kansas early after losing the NCAA final, continuing through leaving the 76ers after losses. And then came the knockout punch. Kareem wrote that Wilt would be remembered as a whining crybaby and a quitter, stats and all. There it was again, that word, quitter. The exact insult that cut Wilt deepest because it echoed the racist attacks on his character from decades earlier. Wilt fired back in his book, calling Kareem a phony, bragging about his superior shooting percentage against him. But the damage was done. The feud never healed. They never truly reconciled before Wilt died in 1999. Kareem only praised Wilt after his death, when Wilt couldn't argue back anymore. The whole thing exposed a sad truth about Wilt. He needed to be the greatest so badly, to protect his legacy so fiercely, that he destroyed relationships with the only other men who understood what it meant to be that dominant. But let's be clear about what really drove all this bitterness. Yes, Wilt faced real racism. Yes, the burden of representation was real, but somewhere along the way, Wilt let that justified anger curdle into something toxic. He became so sensitive to criticism, so obsessed with protecting his image that he couldn't accept even legitimate feedback. Bob Cousy might have been wrong about racism, but Wilt's response was to dismiss anyone who wasn't black and at his level. Russell might have been unfair about the injury, but Wilt's response was decades of silence over the specific form of an apology. Kareem might have hit below the belt, but Wilt started that fight by spending years publicly attacking his successor. Wilt's unforgiveness wasn't strength, it was fragility disguised as pride. He built that fortress mansion to protect himself from a racist world, but then he stayed in that fortress even when the doors were open. He pushed away everyone who loved him because they didn't love him exactly the way he demanded. He turned every disagreement into a war because he couldn't separate critique of his game from attacks on his soul. By 1999, Wilt Chamberlain had achieved everything. Records that still stand today, wealth, fame, a place in history that nobody could take away. But he died with his two most important relationships frozen in bitterness. Russell hadn't spoken to him in over 2 decades. Kareem only said nice things after he was gone. The irony is stunning. Wilt sacrificed personal connection for pride, warm relationships for legacy protection, friendship for the appearance of being unbreakable. And for what? So he could be right? So nobody could say he was a quitter? Here's the thing though, Wilt's dominance was real. Those 100 points, that 50-point scoring average, the absurd rebounding numbers, all of it happened. Wilt really was that incredible, but greatness on the court doesn't excuse bitterness off it. Wilt could have been both the greatest and a good friend. He could have set records and forgiven Russell. He could have mentored Kareem instead of attacking him, but he chose pride every single time. And that choice left him alone in that big house above Los Angeles, surrounded by trophies but starved for genuine human connection. The saddest part? Wilt probably thought he won those feuds. He maintained his pride. He never backed down. He got the last word by outlasting Cousy's criticism, by refusing Russell's insufficient apology, by hitting back at Kareem harder than Kareem hit him. But winning feuds isn't the same as winning at life. And by any measure that actually matters, by friendship, by peace, by the ability to forgive and be forgiven, Wilt lost badly. Now, before we wrap this up, if you've made it this far, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Drop a comment about whether you think Wilt's unforgiveness was justified or if he took things too far. And share this with any basketball fans who need to understand the complete story of one of the game's most complicated legends. But let's end on this. For all his flaws, for all that bitterness and pride, Wilt Chamberlain matters. His story matters because he showed us what happens when trauma hardens into armor so thick that nobody can get through it. He showed us how racism doesn't just hurt in the moment, but echoes through decades, warping relationships and poisoning potential friendships. Yes, Wilt made choices. Bad choices about forgiveness, about pride, about what really matters. But those choices came from real pain, from a world that celebrated his body while denying his humanity. Wilt died in 1999, alone but unbroken, still convinced he was right, still protecting that carefully constructed image of invincibility, still carrying those grudges he mistook for strength. The 5 players and people he never forgave, Clyde Levelette and those racist opponents, that housing developer Bob Cousy who dismissed his experience, Bill Russell who questioned his heart, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar who called him a quitter, they all lived rent-free in Wilt's head until the very end. Maybe that's the real tragedy. Wilt Chamberlain, the most physically dominant player in basketball history, spent his final years dominated by anger he couldn't release and pride he wouldn't surrender. He was the strongest man in the game who couldn't carry the weight of his own unforgiveness, and that's a lesson worth remembering.